So today we've got a very special guest, Dr. Mark Engstrom, and this is the bio that I got offline, Mark. So you can correct it as you will. Dr. Engstrom has served as the ROM's Deputy Director of Collections and Research since 2013 until his retirement about a month ago. I'm not quite sure because of the pandemic. Mark stayed on, I think, a little longer than he was planning. But in his role, not only was he my boss for my entire career, no matter where I moved in the museum, but he was, responsible for the big picture of maintaining the integrity and quality of the museum's intellectual capital, namely its collections and curatorial research programs, as well as the day-to-day operations. Mark, his claim to fame is having signed more approval forms than any other senior manager in the history of the ROM. And I think that's true because I gave him probably half of those things to sign. He's also responsible for the long-term strategic planning and the integration of the back of house curatorial operations, museum initiatives, education, programming, and exhibits. He's also responsible for maintaining the rigor and funding of the museum's international academic research. And Mark was also responsible for collections at the time of REN-ROM, which I think was a big upheaval for collections in the back of house as we prepared the front of house for new visitors. So Mark has obtained his PhD in wildlife and fishery sciences from Texas, and he also went to Fort Hays State University in Kansas, and his Bachelor of Science from Duluth in 1975. So he joined the ROM in 1988 as a curator of mammals, and he's cross-appointed to the U of T as an associate professor of zoology. He's held numerous research grants, including the National Science Foundation, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, the National Geographic Society, and Conservation International. His research on evolutionary biology and systematics of mammals has resulted in publication of over 100 scientific papers, books, and chapters. In 2014, and we've discussed this in class, Mark, just so you know.
Have you?
Well, we were looking at a homegrown exhibition that was a little over the top. So we did look at the whale project. So in 2014, Mark and his team made news around the world when they went to Newfoundland to work on the preservation of skeletons and tissue samples of two blue whales, with the goal of making them available for scientific research, as well as exhibitions. So one remains at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and the other was part of the blockbuster exhibition Out of the Depths, a Blue Whale Story, which we hosted in 2017. And I think the role that you're in now, Mark, I'm not quite sure. So Mark is retired as the Deputy Director of Collections, and has now moved on to, I think, finish some special projects. And I'm going to suggest that maybe the next blue whale exhibition is kind of the cherry on the top of that. I don't know.
That's
to
correct.
me, it is. I think it's going to be an awesome show. There's a continuation of that exhibition, so it's not just the same show again. So it's called Into the Deep: A Tale of Three Whales. So that is my introduction to Mark. As I say, he's been my boss for 23 years, minus my hiatus at the AKM, and so, Mark, I am going to turn this over to you. You can correct anything or add to it.
Thank you. No, that's great, Stephanie. We are doing another whale exhibition, so please come back to the ROM at the end of June, and we're opening and we're doing the exhibition this time will be on right whales, sperm whales, and blue whales. So we're doing all three, and we're talking about conservation of whales on Canada's east coast. So. And we just and I have been so I've been keeping busy. I'm kind of fading off the scene here as I'm no longer deputy director for collections and research, but I'm heading the exhibition team, and we'll be here in June when we open it, and we're continuing our research. We just submitting today a paper to Nature on the genome of the blue whale, which is actually it turns out to be quite a hopeful story in terms of its population genetics. But that's another story, and I believe I'm here today to talk about repatriation. Correct? Okay, ready? So can everyone hear?
Sorry about that. I couldn't find my mic. Yes, please, Mark. Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me. and we're good. So, again, I'm happy to talk about any aspects of collections management. I've been running, sort of head of the system. It's more herding cats than it is my organizational ability. But and as Stephanie said, she personally brings me at least half of the volume of things that I sign. So Stephanie has helped me achieve the marker of having signed more paper than anybody at the museum. These days, we're starting to do it electronically, so my record will never be beaten, by the way. But I would like to talk, and I'll just talk to you a bit about the special topic of repatriation, because it's one that is rapidly evolving and one that has changed markedly during my tenure as Director of Collections and Research. And I've been involved with it, throughout, even though one would think the primary people who would be involved would be in the collections for Indigenous art and culture, and that is certainly true. But I've been sort of a point person with our board, and working with each of working with the people in the Indigenous art and culture collection to mediate various issues that have come up over time. And the ROM collection is an interesting one. We are a colonial institution. We're in the process of trying to decolonize the place, and I think it's going to take us a while. It took us a while to colonize it. And there are a number of initiatives that we will be taking to try to change the way that we approach Indigenous art and culture at the ROM. If you look at the collection, it has a kind of a typical history. The ROM's collection, as you know, started out as it was the University of Toronto's museum. So we opened in 1914. In 1914, we had a number of collections come to us from the University of Toronto. In fact, all the starting collections for the ROM were U of T collections. In Indigenous art and culture, one of the ones was from a collection called the Normal School Collection, which had come to the U of T, to Victoria College, and so on. Has some very important objects, and it's a large collection. Unfortunately, it's poorly documented. So if we're talking about registration, and we're talking about issues regarding registration, I think some of the biggest issues that we have when we look for potential repatriation of objects is how good our record keeping has been. Again, Normal School Collection came in. Much of it is documented simply by its catalog entries, and that's it. And so we don't have all the correspondence that goes with it and so on. We like to say it's not our fault, but that is the state of that collection. And that's not unusual for historical collections. As we moved into the 1920s through the 1970s, I would say, our registration documentation and so on became progressively better. And it'll be somewhat spotty, but as you go through time, our records regarding objects will have improved significantly. And of course, today our documentation is even better. So, but all that affects how one can go about repatriation, how one can go about responding to claims, and how one can go about providing access to collections for Indigenous communities. So registration is critically important to this process and documentation of collections on databases and largely through registration records and conservation records. To document the collections. So the ROM's collection has evolved over time. I would say if you looked at the collection early on, you would see that it was coming from, well, initially it was materials that had already been at the U of T that got assembled into the ROM to form their collections. Then through time, we received a lot of donations. So there were a lot of individual collectors who might be interested people who collected Indigenous objects. There might have been missionaries, there might have been soldiers, there may have been RCMP personnel and so on that were making collections that were tended to be collections of things that they thought were important and were interesting. So again, this is not an Indigenous voice that's making these collections. It is a Western voice that's collecting objects that they thought were interesting to them. So it might be day-to-day objects, it might be fishing gear, it might be it might be hunting implements. It might be all kinds of things. So it's really dependent on who was doing it. So the ROM also purchased collections during that time, which I thought were very important, historical collections and so on that had been assembled by other donors and had been put up for sale. We have, I would say, if you look at present day collecting, And by the way, that's for Indigenous art and culture. If you look at our archaeology collections, the ROM had a very active archaeology program from about 1920 to 1970 in Ontario, especially. And we were a central repository for all the archaeology that was going on in Ontario. The ROM had right of first refusal on objects to be deposited here, and that was still through the 60s. That ended then at that point in time. But the rest of the ROM has a large collection of material, of archaeological material from Ontario, which is largely Indigenous. I would say 95% of it, that's Indigenous material. So we have that legacy. Today we don't, archaeology we still practice archaeology. Craig Cipolla is our North American archaeologist. He's primarily working in the northern US with the Mohawk Nation, but we'll be transferring a lot of that work to Ontario. He tends to be interested in periods of time that are more recent, but nonetheless, all of his work will be done in concert with Indigenous peoples, and we are unlikely to keep most of this material unless it's regarded as not being of significance to communities. So archaeological material is no longer being accumulated like it was in the past, and that collection will, as we move forward, will continue to be more historical. In terms of the art and culture collection, we are primarily collecting, as we go forward, contemporary art. So there's much more contemporary art and cultural objects that are being collected and donated by individual communities than historical material. So we're not on the market trying to buy historical collections. We're not accepting very many donations, nor are they offered to us, and so on. So the nature of collecting and even the volume of collecting is changing significantly over time at the museum. At the same time, we're trying to provide more access to those materials. So if you look at our collection as a whole, we have a very large collection of art and archaeology. And Stephanie, you could probably tell me better than I. If you look at if you look at the Indigenous art and culture collection, I'm going to guess we have between 40 and 50,000 objects in that collection, of which the majority will be from North America.
Yeah, I'd say that's good. That's good, accurate.
Yeah. The archaeology collection is not as well documented for individual objects because in case of archaeological digs, you catalog the bits out of the digs that are of interest to somebody's project, and other material stays as reserve. So, but we know we have well over 100,000 objects in the archaeology collection. It's a very significant collection, and it's one again that's changing over time, and the way we're working with it changing over time. So if we look at the issue of repatriation, sort of shifting gears a bit, repatriation has really evolved significantly so I've been deputy director, or was deputy director, from 2003 to 2019. 2020, I guess I was still director this year, but deputy director. But when I first started, repatriation requests were few and far between. We had inklings of people being interested and communities being interested in the subject of repatriation, but it was not, we would get maybe 1 or 2 requests a year at most. In some years, maybe you'd be 2 years between requests. And the requests themselves took a long time to respond to, in turn, because there were a lot of hurdles to jump and so on. And we also had, and we still have to, any objects that are deaccessioned or repatriated have to go through our board of trustees for approval. That, I would say when I first started, that was a tough road to hoe, because the board of trustees were at that time concerned about wholesale repatriation of the entire collection, et cetera, which is a false narrative. But they were concerned about that, and they have changed, I would say, 180 degrees, and are much more supportive now. And so I've never had a repatriation proposal that we put forward be turned down by the board. And I get almost no questions about it. As a matter of fact, they clap usually when we do it to them today. But if you look at how in Canada, how repatriation has been governed, it is a very different story than the US. So the US and Canada have very different approaches to repatriation. In the U.S. in 1990, they enacted federal legislation, and they call it in the NAGPRA legislation, which develops a procedure by which people can request and which museums must return objects to Indigenous communities if they meet certain criteria. One of the key parts of NAGPRA is it also provides funding to museums and to communities to carry out that repatriation. And there's no such comparable legislation in Canada. In 1989, Canada established, I think it's really the CMA was part of this. The Canadian Museum Association was part of this, but they co-sponsored it. There was a task force established to look at repatriation. It was called the Task Force on Museums and First Peoples, and it went from 1989 to 1992. I think it was a 3-year project, and the results were published in 1994. And that provided a set of objectives and guidelines really for museums to follow. And it's actually still quite a good report. And it was a joint report from Indigenous communities and from some museum leaders, including Trudy Nix from the ROM was one of the co-chairs of that task force. And she's in now retired, but from our Indigenous Art and Culture collection. So that was published in 1994. And outlined again procedures and objectives for repatriation and how the museum should change and how they can work profitably with First Peoples. That led, in terms of the ROM's case, led to the development of our policy. So have people seen our policies on repatriation of human remains and of sacred objects?
They are available on Centennial, so I'm not sure if they've had a chance to take a look.
It'd be worth looking at those. They're short; they're 2 pages each, but it just outlines the ROM's policy regarding. There's 2 different ones. One is on the repatriation of human remains and burial goods, which would have been obtained through the archaeology program, and second one is the repatriation of sacred objects and objects of significant cultural patrimony. And that's where they would refer to 2 different collections here. Their human remains are in the archaeology collections, and the sacred objects, the objects of cultural patrimony are in the Indigenous Art Culture collection. So there's 2 different collections involved there. So the ROM really took the task force's recommendations, used those to construct its own policies regarding repatriation. That helped me enormously. As we're able to go through and use those policies as outlines for our board, and if we follow the procedures in those outlines, they would have a hard time saying no to us. But there remains in Canada, there is no federal legislation regarding repatriation of objects or remains. And I think that's a real hole in Canada's approach to this. The Trudeau government has suggested that there would be legislation coming, and that they had formed a group to study it, but I've not seen any results from that. Unless you have, Stephanie. No, yeah. But there have been some significant developments since that time. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report came out in 2015. It has a number. If you read it, it's available online. It's an interesting report in regarding museums, in that there are very few specific callouts to museums in the TRC, which is interesting. The one thing they did suggest is that the CMA needed to basically establish another task force to develop recommendations that eventually they would hope would become part of legislation. The CMA has not acted on that to date. I believe they eventually formed a committee, but they haven't, given the COVID situation, that no progress has been made. But I'm expecting that will happen in the future. That is somewhat stagnant at the moment. What the TRC does do, though, the TRC report does, is it defers in some cases to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples report on museums. And that report has a much more detailed list of recommendations and objectives for museums to follow regarding repatriation. And Canada has said that they will adopt the UN direct report, as it's called, and the recommendations that if that happens legislatively, then the landscape is going to change regarding repatriation of objects, and also the funding. But the trouble is, in Canada, there's no funding behind it. So this is actually a costly exercise. And one of our issues is we need to hire more personnel to assist with this and to work with communities. And we need to provide funds just for communities to visit the collections, see what's here, and then we can develop a better, more proactive repatriation plan. Nonetheless, that's where Canada stands regarding any legislation or recommendations regarding repatriation. It's kind of every museum for itself, in some sense. You can get some stimulus from the province and so on, but it's usually more rooting for you than it is funding. As it turns out, so if you look across Canada, you will see a heterogeneous landscape for repatriation and repatriation initiatives, and parts of the country and institutions that are ahead of the curve versus others. I would say we're in the middle of the pack. I like to think we're doing well, but we're not as advanced as several institutions in BC are, including the Royal British Columbia Museum, or especially the BC University of British Columbia, and their museums I would say are much further ahead of us. And one of the ways in which they're ahead of us, and something that was recommended in the task force, and I might go through some of the recommendations of the task force here. The original one back in 1994 was the hiring of Indigenous personnel. I'm convinced that you're never going to make real progress on this subject, man, no matter how sympathetic people are in the institution, if we do not have Indigenous people helping run the programs who are hired by the ROM and on our staff. And I think it's critical for us to be providing, I think there's a real opportunity too for the ROM to be providing training programs for Indigenous personnel. But I think we need to have people on staff, and not just in critical roles in collections research. We need to have security guards, and we need to have directors of the museum, et cetera, to be Indigenous. That will come eventually, I think. But one of our first steps in that is we're right in the process right now of hiring an Indigenous curator who will be the lead curator for the Indigenous art and culture collection. And I'm hoping that we will eventually be able to hire somebody for archaeology and somebody for contemporary art. But those two positions are in the future, and they're in my mind's eye, and I've been proposing them to management. But we also have an Indigenous learning program, which is actually farther ahead of our curatorial program, which is also meeting one of the recommendations of the original task force, which was to provide more Indigenous interpretation for their own cultural objects, rather than through again this colonial lens. So if you look at if you go back to the task force, and again, it's one of the best. If you want to go back to something that will help you see where Canada should be going with its museums, that task force report in 1994 remains the best, I think. There's lots of talks, and there's lots of proposals since, and I think there's some really good reports coming out of BC about how to approach this. But as an outline for how to approach the objectives for repatriation, I think the task force remains quite a relevant document. They suggested that I guess they had several recommendations in the report, and I can just kind of go through how the ROM is dealing with those recommendations. They want that one of the problems with colonial institutions, and certainly the case of the ROM, I think originally people were collecting things. When you look at objects that are being collected and items that are being collected in the 1800s, for example, and including our Paul Kane painting collection, which is very well known, people thought they were documenting a disappearing culture. This culture was going to be gone, and people were actively trying to destroy it, by the way, with a residential school program and other ill-advised initiatives. That the original culture for Indigenous people was going to disappear, and this was going to be documentation of that culture by collecting these objects. That is an unfortunate approach. The indigenous cultures are alive and thriving and are here with us now, and so is their culture. And they're varied cultures because there's so many different indigenous groups with different cultural practices and so on. One of the first recommendations was that museum collections be treated just not as a collection of historical cultural objects, but instead that they be a way to connect with living cultures, and that the focus should be on living cultures rather than necessarily a strict focus on history. So that was one of the recommendations, and I think that's a direction in which we're moving, and a direction which I hope we will change our gallery, which at the has a primary historical focus at the moment. It's got some contemporary glimpses in there, but it's not. I would expect us to make some progress in that, and I hope someday that we can redo that gallery. One of the key issues in the task force was that First Peoples need to be involved in interpretation, and rather than having it come from the perspective simply of the non-Indigenous curatorial staff. And I think we're making progress in that. Again, we will as we hire a new curator who's Indigenous, but we also have established we have a education lead and 6 Indigenous teachers who are and we have somebody in the gallery at peak times whenever the gallery is operating to help interpret the objects from an Indigenous perspective. And I expect to see that appear more and more on our labeling, which was done during ROM, but that we be able to change that and again provide more. The gallery and the museum's programs need to be led by an Indigenous voice if we're talking about Indigenous culture. The third point the task force brought up was we need to improve access to the collections, and we've been working hard at that. We invite communities in and family groups in to visit objects. We have a sacred room that we've established where objects can be smudged and ceremonies can be performed. It's the only place in the museum that you can smoke, and has a separate ventilation system that goes to the roof. People don't typically smoke there, but we smoke sweetgrass and things like that in there for ceremonial use. And we try to invite people in to visit their objects and make them accessible as much as possible. I think one of the issues that we have is that people feel that some people are very reluctant to come to the museum. That some people have, they have a poor impression of the museum, and they're reluctant to come in even sometimes. So it's going to take us a long time to get through that. And I think, again, having Indigenous personnel in the collection will help. But we have been working very actively to try to bring people in and actually utilize the collection. So not just visit them, but be able to. And we have a number of examples where people have come in to try to work through and discover historical techniques for weaving and so on that they're trying to repeat and trying to recreate. And they've been able to use the objects in the collection to help do that. We brought family members in to visit their objects from their community, which they didn't realize were here. And in some cases, those will stimulate repatriation requests too. So again, we've been proactive in trying to do that as much as we can. This COVID is not a great time to do that, of course, but even our own people are encouraged to be working from home today. We are. They want to do they talk about training of Indigenous personnel, which is something that we're trying to do more and more of. And I hope again we can do that through additional hires of Indigenous peoples. And then there was a recommendation, of course, regarding repatriation. So there was 2 sets of in the task force, which was the beginning. There was 2 sets of recommendations. One was about repatriation of human remains and grave goods, which forms our first policy. And then there's something about and then repatriation of objects that are significant sacred objects or objects of significant cultural patrimony. And that's the one that is the section that and we treat these these are 2 different policies, and we treat them differently in terms of where we are in the project. So back in the 1930s to I'd say about 1960s. There were many active archaeological programs, and one of the things that people did was collect skeletal remains from graves and mounds. And so the ROM, like many institutions, had it's not a huge collection, but it's a significant collection of human remains. We have actively been we've went through a long project where we documented all the human remains in our collection as best we can, but they're well documented according to Indigenous protocols, and we had people hired to help us on those projects. We have identified all the collections that we have, and we are in the process we have been responding to requests for repatriation of those remains, but we're now in a phase where we're being proactive, contacting communities to let them know we have these collections and talking about how we could return them. And so this just includes any object that was, it includes your human remains and ancestors, and it includes objects, grave goods that were associated with the ancestors. We've had some very good successes. We had a large repatriation effort with the Rainy River First Nation, and then that was I guess about 6 months ago now. And we are in active discussions with several groups. The largest portion of our collections, our Indigenous remains collections, are with the Huron-Wendat, which is interesting because Huron-Wendat now are primarily outside of Ontario, and they're in Quebec or New York State or Michigan. But we've been working with them to try to repatriate Huron-Wendat remains as well. So I expect that the ROM over the next 5 to 10 years will no longer have any human remains in its collection, Indigenous human remains, and they will be repatriated in total. So that's a very proactive section, and we've been able to hire, actually through interested donors. We've been actually on a campaign to be able to hire people to assist with that. So we have an Indigenous technician, for example, who's hired that works with Craig on documentation and return of human remains, and we have a second person who's working on collections in general, but works a lot on grave goods that we also return. So so we're actively working on that one, and we're, as I said, entering a phase where we're being proactive. For the art and archaeology collection, the art and cultures collections, I would say we're still in a reactive phase. We're trying to invite people in. When people make requests, we respond to them, but we haven't been in a position necessarily to reach out to communities, with the exception of British Columbia. So we've reached out to several communities there, both the Haida, for example, and the Nisga'a people there. And I expect actually a very large repatriation whenever it's requested to go back of several thousand objects that will go back ultimately to BC. But I would say that program has been less proactive, and I'm hoping as we hire, again, more people who are both interested in and are hired to do repatriation on the Indigenous art culture collection, that we'll be able to move that collection to a more proactive phase. So we've another thing that's been of interest is one that was recommended by the task force was that the government support local cultural institutions, not just the ROM, but that they support cultural institutions in Indigenous communities. So we've had some very interesting cases, and for example, a very interesting partnership that we had that we just completed with Manitoulin Island, with the community of Manitoulin Island, where there was an important pipe that was associated with a treaty in the early 1800s, the treaty was signed and gave people on that part of Manitoulin Island independence from Canada. And they've never signed any other treaty. And so I think it's pretty cool. I think they're, in fact, have some degree of autonomy. But this pipe they had a pipe that was given as part of the ceremony, which was an important physical marker of the ceremony in addition to the treaty itself. The pipe was held by a family in Britain, white family in Britain, and they eventually decided they were going to sell So they put it on for sale at an auction house at Bonhams in California. The community contacted us. The chief of the community contacted me and said, "Can you help us? Is there some way?" Because they didn't have the funds to buy it. The ROM didn't have the funds to buy it either. It was expensive. But we were able to go together to CPERB and the Canadian Cultural and Department of Cultural Heritage for Canada and obtain funds to bid. So then the chief wrote a very strongly worded letter to the family saying you shouldn't be selling this object to begin with, or you shouldn't be auctioning it. The family then pulled it off auction and agreed to sell it to us at the proposed hammer price, which we then used the funds from the Canadian government and some a little bit of funds from the ROM, and we purchased the object, and it will then ultimately go back to Manitoulin Island. So in this case, we're acting, in a partnership to return a very important cultural object back to Manitoulin Island.
Can you see my share mark? That's the bond head pipe?
Yep.
Okay,
that's
there
it.
you go.
So we will. That's that's just a very important success story and one that we were able to return. So I think we're moving into different modes where at least some people are beginning to trust us more and realize that that the ROM can help facilitate some repatriation activities that they're interested in as well as us, and that we can actually be important partners rather than adversaries in terms of repatriation. So again, the pace of repatriation, I would say, has picked up. It will it'll continue to do so in the future, and we're going to have to. And one of these. So we have a few obstacles to repatriation. One of which is being able to keep up with the pace of requests because they're all paperwork intensive. As Stephanie can tell you, any deaccession from the collection involves lots of paperwork, and these go through special approvals by the board, etc. So we have to have large reports that go with them, and it's a slightly tedious process. So we need help, funding for people. If you look at it, how is the ROM approaching it? Well, again, we're trying to become more proactive. The museum's attitudes and the museum attitude of the board, as I said, has changed radically for the better, and that's occurred in the last 10 to 15 years, I would say. We also the museum needs to be, and our registrars will have to help us. The museum has to have more flexibility in use and openness to the use of objects and to loans. For example, the pipe for Manitoulin Island initially has to stay at the ROM because the CPERB is involved, and they will not allow it to go to Manitoulin Island until we can demonstrate that there's a place that it can be stored properly they have a building for it. So we're working on that to help them get a grant to build this building. In the meantime, it'll be held at the ROM. But when there's ceremonies that involve this pipe, the ROM will loan it, and they may loan it for use rather than loan it to be sitting in a case, and they may loan it for an extended period of time. And we just have to be more flexible in terms of the way the museum has approached its sharing of objects in its collection and use of the objects in the collection than it might have done in the past. Again, we're changing the way in which we approach projects, like the example from Manitoulin. We're trying to be more proactive, but there have been, again, I would mention there's a number of issues with repatriations. If you look at just the process of repatriation itself, one of the issues is, and one that comes up continually, is representation for claims. So who is the representative for the group making the claim? Do they represent the wishes of the community? Are they authorized by the tribal council, for example, to represent them in repatriation issues? And it's often when we initially get approached about an object, it turns out not to be somebody that the tribal council wants representing them or doesn't agree. And so often we have to go back to someone who's in the authority for the community, say, who do you wish to speak to you about? Who do you wish having to represent you? for repatriation efforts. And here's the objects in question. Let's talk about them. So it's not a reason, not reluctance on our part to repatriate something, but it's possible. So we had a case, one of the first ones I became involved with in Alberta, where we had a group approach us. One day, 3 people walked in. They came to the museum to visit the collections. They visited a set of sacred bundles called beaver bundles, and there was also a headdress bundle, which are used in tobacco ceremonies and various other ceremonies in the Siska Nation in Alberta. And they wanted to take the bundle. They saw the bundles and wanted to take them home that day. And I said, well, we can't do that. We have a whole process that we have to go through and so on. And they represented a foundation there in Alberta. So eventually, it took us a while because we were trying to figure out who the best representative for Sitka Nation was, and they were not going to report it back to the nation. They were going to return it to the Blood Nation. So luckily, Alberta, unlike, again, here's the difference in how regional systems work. Alberta has a registry of Indigenous who is responsible for repatriation of different items for different nations within Alberta. And so we were able to get a hold of the chief, who was the representative for the Sitka Nation, and in terms of repatriation, and he had never heard of this foundation. It did not want us repatriating the objects back to the bundles back to that group. But eventually we worked it out, and they did want the bundles returned. So we worked it out and went through the board. But had we returned the bundles to the foundation, to people from the foundation who originally requested them, it would have caused quite a bit of consternation in the communities because it wouldn't have gone back to the right community. Eventually, by the way, the chief and the tribal council worked with the foundation, and they now have a good relationship. So in fact, they did ultimately share some of the objects with the foundation for ceremonies, and then have them returned. But that was, that often is a real issue, is like who can speak for these objects and makes the request. So that's one of the issues that we have. In other cases, and I can name cases both for the repatriation of human remains and in the archaeology collections, and repatriation of cultural objects in the art and culture collections, where we've had conflicts, where we have 2 different groups claiming the same object or the same set of remains, the same set of ancestors. And that becomes tricky. And that's where registration really has to help us, because we have to, the documentation really comes into play in those cases. You have to, in some cases, we can't resolve the issues, and we have to have the communities work together to resolve the issues themselves. And then, we're happy to repatriate the objects, but we can't be picking and choosing who we repatriate them to if there are conflicts. So that happens on occasion. Again, I would mention when we have lack of good records, that will often impede requests. So if we can't tell where an object is from, we don't know if the record is lost as to who donated it. So like what the passage from one person to another was, we're maybe not positive what community it came from. That will impede the whole repatriation process, trying to determine what's most appropriate. In that case, we need Indigenous consultation, and to have them help us, make the best determination. Again, I would mention that one of the impediments to repatriation is, in some cases, wariness of communities. So if communities don't trust the museum, feel that the museum has been stealing objects from their communities, feel that the museum has not been sharing objects or won't give them access, they may be reluctant to talk to us at all. And that's a problem. And that's one that we just have to, that's going to take a long time to get over, and that's building trust with the communities and so on. Again, I think we have more of a problem with that in Ontario than is currently the case in BC, for example. And so that's, different communities feel differently. There's many communities in Ontario, and people from different places. So I would guess that I would say that people, many people in Toronto Indigenous people in Toronto are more wary of the museum than some communities might be that are farther away. So that doesn't speak well to previous interactions with local communities, but I'm hoping we can get over that. And again, I would say, as I've already mentioned, the lack of Indigenous personnel at the museum. It's very hard to represent Indigenous voice if you don't have Indigenous voices on your staff. And I think that's a probably, if I could pick a critical piece of critical change that the museum needs to make and evolution that the museum needs to make, it's by transforming its staff and have the staff represent the cultures with whom we're dealing. And I would also mention funding is an issue. So again, with NAGPRA in the U.S., the repatriation I think has moved much farther. In some ways, the Canadian approach is better. There are some things about the Canadian approach that are improvements over the way it's done with NAGPRA, which is sometimes adversarial. But which I think it tends not to be here. People tend to cooperate. But the one great thing about NAGPRA, is it has a set of rules, so so people know how they can approach and how the museum has to respond. So I think it's a good thing. Secondly, they fund it, so you can apply for a grant to hire a technician for a year or 6 months, or to build some boxes, to help create some cases, to whatever might be required to be able to transfer the objects and house them properly. And I would say again, it's and funding for access is another issue. So if we want to provide greater access for communities, that's great. But many of these communities live in Northern Ontario, or they live in, they live in Nunavut, or they live in Rainy River, or whatever. It costs money for them to travel here and be able to stay for a couple of weeks or whatever the nature of the interaction with the museum might be. And again, that's funding that we do not have. And we would be looking to the province in our case, or perhaps the federal government, or perhaps in our case, we often look to donors to try to help us support the access of communities to our collections. So again, funding becomes an issue. We have, again, I can give you lots and lots of examples of repatriation cases that I've been involved with. By the way, I would say our program, the ROM is it's the Royal Ontario Museum, but the focus has never been on Ontario. The focus for the ROM has always been to bring the world to Ontario. And so we are very much an international museum. So we also have international repatriation requests. We have no policies that deal directly with international requests, but we treat them much as we would a Canadian request. So we've returned human remains of Maoris back to New Zealand. That was the case I was involved with very early on. It's a very moving case, actually. And then we've just recently returned a sets of masks, or in process of returning sets of masks to Six Nations in Ontario. But then there are a related set of masks that were from the Tuscarora Nation and the Seneca Nation in the U.S., in the northeastern U.S. And we've now agreed to return the masks to Six Nations, who are then going to distribute them to the Seneca and the Tuscarora Nation, who have both agreed to that process. And so we figured out a way to repatriate objects back, in this case, to the U.S. without, and it's done in partnership with First Nations, which actually facilitated a quick transfer. So I've done a lot of talking here. So I wonder if there are any questions about where the ROM stands with repatriation, or the ROM's philosophy about it, or what I expect for the future.
Actually, Mark, can I just jump in? Can I ask a question? Oh, sorry, Azaz. It's just related to what you were just talking about, how we have policies in place to repatriate to Canadian communities, but not outside of Canada. Is that something that is being worked on in the background?
It has not been, but it needs to be. We have simply done it. We've created a practice, by previous examples of ways to work with doing international repatriations. I would say early on, when the first repatriation event projects I ever got involved with. We brought it back to the board, said I think actually might have been the Maori human remains. And we brought the collection forward, said we want to repatriate these. It's very important. This is a international standard to do these repatriations, etc. It's very important culturally. And the ROM board agreed. But at that time, again, this is 20 years ago, the board was, some members of the board said, well, gee, does that mean we're going to send back everything? Does that mean we have to send back our mummies to Egypt and our flags to Somalia and so on? Well, maybe we do, but that wasn't the point. The point was that that there was concern. There was just, and it's kind of the Elgin Marbles case all over again, where people are worried about, oh, if you let this go, then everything goes from the museum. Well, we don't have to worry about that. We've got lots of stuff. The repatriation requests are always well thought out and justified. And I would say that again today that attitude just isn't there at all. And we have been successful in every international repatriation request that we have had, but we should have a specific policy about it. I agree.
Thank you. Azaz had a question, and then there's one in the chat.
Okay.
My question was yours, Stephanie. Thanks, Mark, for that. So it's just really what the international policy and approach was.
Yeah, and it's going to change, by the way, because I'm expecting, for example, we have a very important Ethiopian flag, which was, it was captured during a war, and I think it's been split in half, and half of it is at the ROM, and the other half is at the British Museum. And there's been discussion about the potential for us to return that. And I'm sure if we are asked and get a formal request, I'm quite positive that we would return it. So I think this is more than just remains. I think there will be transfer of objects back. I expect there are, the Benin sculptures is another one. ROM has very few of those, but I'm expecting that that if we receive a request, we would return those as well. I got involved at most of the international cases, with the exception of New Zealand and a few in the US, actually have been from Africa. So it's I think of another one, we're involved with some Knox sculptures, which we refused to take, and we're trying to get back to Nigeria. We're trying to get the donor to get it, but you're not the donor, the collector. We refused to take the objects, and so trying to work with the Canadian government and the Nigerian government to get them back to Nigeria, even though they're kind of half fake. They're pastiches of objects. But
Thank you very much. As a Nigerian, that makes me smile.
Oh, are you Nigerian?
Thanks.
Oh, yeah,
I'm Nigerian.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, the Knox sculptures have been really, that's been a really interesting case, because that case I've been working on for 8 years. And it involved the RCMP. We got the RCMP involved. We got all, so it was very interesting and very drawn out.
Thank you very much. I think it was also really interesting for me to learn about the celebratory room for the indigenous peoples. I think that's such a thoughtful approach. So thank you for sharing.
Well, if you look at there's a Western way of looking at objects, and there's an indigenous way of looking at items, and I think it's just a different thought pattern about them. But for indigenous peoples, typically the objects have spirit, and I think they do for Western people too, but they don't think of it that way. So I think in the same sense that you have, I don't know, maybe it's maybe you got a gold watch that your father gave you when you were. I got a gold watch in my house that my dad gave me when he worked on the railroad. He worked for 50 years, and they gave him a gold watch. And I still have his gold stopwatch. But that makes me think of him. It's got some spirit, right? I look at that watch, and my memories come back of my dad. And I think so. In some sense, and I think it's much more profound than that for indigenous peoples. But the indigenous peoples then, when engage with objects, objects need to be blessed. They need to be fed. They need to be talked to. And they often have been sitting in a museum, and nobody's talked to them for 50 years. It's moving, and it's important.
that sort of Melissa's question in the chat sort of follows that. Did you want me to read it, or what staff at the ROM is responsible for facilitating the community engagement / community access to pieces in the collection?
So primarily it's the personnel in the collections personnel themselves. So it's the collections technicians and the curators and assistant curators in those sections who are responsible for facilitating access. So if someone is interested in having access, they could write to the deputy director, who could then distribute, who's now Linda Hardigan, who's taken over for me, who would then contact the appropriate curator, or they can write directly to the Department of Art and Culture, or directly to the curators themselves. One way or another, that the request would get to that section. But it's the people in the sections that are responsible for providing access for communities. Again, in some cases, we also work with our education staff to facilitate that. So we had a joint program, a very interesting one from Northern Ontario, where we actually purchased a set of recent baskets that people who had been weaving. They had actually done some work at the ROM to recreate some weaving patterns, and then they did a temporary exhibition here, and the community worked with both us and worked with our Indigenous education staff to present the materials and do a program on it. So sometimes we involve other people in other parts of the museum, so the curatorial section is not isolated. It works together with both exhibitions and education, etc. But if anybody's got a question, they can always send me an email. They don't know who to contact if they want to find out how to get access, and we'll get to the right people.
Great, thank you, Mark. We've got another question here. It's related to the return of the looted Kapoor artifacts. So not quite what we've been talking about, but still relevant nonetheless. Yeah,
that's a different kind of issue, but yeah. And what would you like to know about them? We had two. So that's an interesting case. When you buy, that relates back to provenance and the whole issue of provenance and due provenance for objects. The ROM follows the UNESCO convention, which was originally proposed in 1970. I think Canada signed much later than 1970, but we go back to 1970. So any object that's been exported from a country of origin, whether that country is a signatory to the UNESCO convention or not, past 1970, has to have documentation that it left the country with the approval of the authorities in that country. So it has to have proper export documentation. You can't. So working through provenance is a tricky issue because people provide, so how do you demonstrate provenance? So maybe somebody exported something and maybe it came in, maybe it's been sitting, maybe you're buying it now. Somebody claims they've had it in their home since 1960. And, then they write a letter saying my grandfather collected these things in, Chile in 1960. And has had them in their house ever since. Now we want to sell them. Well, what documentation do you have for that? And so on. And so you can provide affidavits. You can provide, so what is the level of proof that's required? And I would say every year the level of proof that we require goes up, and we get much stricter about these kinds of things. In the case of the Kapoor objects, he provided documentation, which was falsified. From both the exporter and from the original collector. We actually purchased, and he was a very well-known art dealer, and had been well established in the U.S., so people hadn't really questioned his honesty. And it turned out the ROM had bought a series of objects as it was trying to actually establish its South Asia collection, and of the objects that the ROM purchased, I think there might have been, I'm going to guess there were like 10, somewhere in that neighborhood. 2 of them were on the bad list. It turned out to had fake documentation. We got caught in that. When we did that, we contacted Homeland Security in the US, which was leading the case against Kapoor. And then we returned those objects. So, I think even if you do your best diligence, your due diligence, you are at times going to get tricked. And each of those kinds of cases makes us more wary of, I hope there are no dealers in your class, but I have learned that one has to be wary of dealers, and that they are of art dealers, and some are more scrupulous than others, and you can't always tell from the surface. So you can't just take their word for things.
Yeah, or even necessarily their provenance documentation, because
Exactly.
their forgers are very good.
Well, he did. He had a really great forger working with him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they forged everything from the export papers to correspondence to all sorts of things. Yeah. And does anyone else have any questions from the crowd? You put up your hand, turn on your mic, pop it in the chat. No. Wow, it's a quiet group. Oh, Leela has a question. Do First Nations communities also require a high level of documentation / legal representation when they file a repatriation claim?
No, they do not. So that burden falls on, and it's not so much legal as it is just paperwork that we have to do at the background of the object here. But no, normally people make a request. We would require some, or we would ask for some justification of the objects being of significant cultural patrimony if we had any question about that. And in many cases, there's no question. But some would just outline why they would be of ceremonial use, or why they ever imported that community, and that's it, right? So we don't require. There's no legal documentation in that case. So the only time that lawyers get involved is if there's a case where an object ultimately is proven to be stolen or illegally obtained, which is always possible in the Kapoor case, for example. And then you want to have lawyers involved. But Indigenous cultures, when they're making Indigenous communities, if they're going to make a repatriation request, they send it to us. If it's legitimate, we act on it.
Great, thank you. Another question from the chat. What is the most challenging repatriation that you've worked on?
Oh, well, there's one that's going to hit the papers before too long that you'll. It's actually in a good way, but it's been a challenging one to work on, which I can't discuss because we have to get it sent back first. But I would say, well, the Kapoor one was an interesting one, but that was that really because I had to testify in front of Homeland Security, which was interesting. But I would say the most challenging one is, might have been the beaver bundles, the one that I already mentioned. It was very drawn out because we had a very hard time determining how many claims there were for the same objects, and then trying to sort through who was the legitimate claimant, and then being able to return them. There was never a question that we wanted to return them. It was a question of who to give them back to, and that took quite a bit of sorting out, and it took a while for us to actually find the chief to contact and find the right nation to contact. So, and it had originally there'd been an original family that owned it, and it's interesting. This whole business of ownership is an interesting question, because according to the community, if you have ceremonial bundles, they're not owned by anyone. They are owned by the community in some general sense, and in fact, they are transferred from person to person depending on who's the keeper of the object at that time. But someone sold them to us, and so from a Western perspective, you would say, well, some family gave them to us. So was that family the owner of the object originally? So anyway, it was a whole complicated set of questions about representation for the objects and ownership. So that one turned out, it just took a while, and actually it was one of the first involved ones that I was involved with, and it took us a while to sort out what we were doing and how to approach the board, and how to work with the community and so on. So I it's become much easier as we've done more of these more repatriations, and it's become much smoother.
Thank you, Mark. Another question from the chat. Melissa asks, you referred to an Indigenous education program. Is there a section of the ROM website that shares more information about that? And while you were chatting, I looked up the Our Voices, Our History section. Would that be appropriate?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure how education has their website set up right now, but
Okay.
But that's really a question. Stephanie can answer that as well as I can. But but Jeanette is the person to contact about it for information.
I've put a link in there, and we'll try to see if we can find out any more information. That's just a quick search that I did, so that might not be the definitive. That might not be the definitive answer, but there is an Indigenous resource team. I think there are a number of student or facilitators working in the front end.
There's 6 of them. Yeah, there's six positions. Yeah, and that was one. And interestingly, you know, we've had the ROM has been going. There's a whole another issue about working through COVID and how that's affected the museum, and that's a discussion we could have another day. But the one of the issues we've had is people being on leave and so on, and we've made sure that we kept that group of staff on staff. You know, that we don't have them on leave.
Another question from the chat. Do you have any advice for emerging museum professionals who are Indigenous and interested in working on repatriation?
Oh, I think the world is your oyster. I think I would develop some, if there are people who are interested and are Indigenous. I think museums are rapidly changing. They're going to eventually have to respond, I hope, to legislation that museums are again becoming much more proactive. And there's a dearth of personnel available who are Indigenous to deal with these issues. If you get trained, you are trained in repatriation issues and so on, and are well versed in the topic and are Indigenous, there will be a variety of positions available to you, and there's very few candidates available. So it's a real opportunity for employment. And there are a number of institutions looking for exactly those kinds of people right now, including us.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So, Alicia, get your resume ready.
No, there's a real opportunity. The other thing that I would hope that the ROM, you know, my ambition for the ROM is that the ROM, because we're a big institution, and probably, you know, we're probably kind of on par with the Museum of Man or Museum of History in Ottawa in terms of size. That I would like to see the ROM be a center for training, especially for Indigenous people in various programs, museum programs. So if we're going to get Indigenous people to take over the function for Indigenous art, culture, and museums and archaeology, etc., that we need those people running our programs, and we need to train them because there's not enough training programs. So I would hope the ROM would be involved in both in hiring people and then in subsequent training, and to build up the cadre of people who could fill those positions.
That sounds great. Thank you.
So you can maybe teach at the ROM, and you could also work in repatriation itself.
Yeah, and you're based out in Calgary, I believe, aren't you? It's been weird teaching. Yeah, she's out in Calgary, so even more opportunity, I would think.
Well, Calgary's interesting. So I've worked a bit with the museum there. With the Royal Alberta Museum, and in terms of how they're kind of approaching, they're more natural history, but they're approaching how they deal with now they're approaching how they deal with specimens, and how they do the scientific interpretation in both an Indigenous voice and a Western voice, which are quite different, and trying to figure out how to present both points of view. But there's quite a bit going on in Alberta, and I also think there's a lot of opportunities in Alberta, and ranging from, and of course, and a variety of museums. But it's a very different landscape than Ontario.
Great, thank you. Other questions, or just turn on your mic, speak up? No. Well, Mark, I guess I'll take this as an opportunity to thank you so much for speaking so candidly and openly with our students. It was a lesson for me as well, so thank you for that. And if anyone has any questions for Mark, you can just send them to me, and I'll make sure that they get to Mark. So thank you once again on behalf of Centennial College MCMC 705.
Well, thank you, and if you would like, I can always come back and talk to you about any other kind of aspects of collections management too. But
excellent. Well, thank you so much. This is actually our last class of the year. I was saving you for the end, Mark.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe next year.
Excellent. Absolutely. I'll take you up on that.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for having me.